Hello, I'm Joe H., and this is Road to Answers. Today we're going to be looking at Exodus 11. Does God get angry? Well, yes, he does. However, we must not think his anger is like ours. He is patient, just, righteous, and loving. His anger is an expression of all of these characteristics. It is his love and it is his justice that moves him to anger. In Exodus 11, we have an example of how God showed his anger. The story of Exodus 11 started way before the plagues. The story of Exodus started back in the days of Abraham, when God told Abraham that Abraham's descendants would be slaves in a foreign land. We find that in Genesis 15. The fulfilling of that promise is the story of Exodus. By the time we reach Exodus 11, God has struck Egypt with 9 plagues. With this 9th plague, we see something different. With the first 8 plagues, Moses seemed to be told what was coming next about the time the Egyptians were. However, at the end of the 9th plague, Moses knew what was coming next. So, in the 9th plague, after 3 days of absolute darkness, Pharaoh told Moses, "Go and worship the Lord," he said, "but leave your flocks and herds here. You may even take your little ones with you." Of course, this was not acceptable, so Moses said, "No, you must provide us with animals for the sacrifices and burnt offerings to the Lord our God. All our livestock must go with us. Not a hoof can be left behind. We must choose our sacrifices for the Lord our God from among these animals, and we won't know how we are to worship the Lord until we get there." Finally, Pharaoh had had enough. He told Moses, "Get out of here. I'm warning you, never come back to see me again. The day you see my face, you will die." Moses responded, "Very well. I will never see your face again." These words of Moses end Exodus chapter 10, but they do not end the words of Moses to Pharaoh. Moses does not stop talking to Pharaoh until Exodus 11:8, where it tells us that, burning with anger, Moses left Pharaoh. So Exodus 11, 1 through 3, is an interlude or an explanation. These verses explain to us the preparation that has been going on behind the scenes before Moses spoke to Pharaoh. Exodus 11, 1 through 3 says, "The Lord said to Moses, 'Yet one plague more I will bring upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. Afterward, he will let you go from here. When he lets you go, he will drive you away completely. Speak now in the hearing of the people that they ask every man of his neighbor and every woman of her neighbor for silver and gold jewelry.' And the Lord gave the people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. Moreover, the man Moses was very great in the land of Egypt, in the sight of Pharaoh's servants and in the sight of the people." Moses knew that there would be yet one more plague. Exodus 11:1 tells us that God had told Moses that he would bring just one more plague upon Pharaoh in Egypt. So this time Moses went into Pharaoh's presence with foreknowledge of what was going on. Pharaoh is angry with Moses, and Moses is angry with Pharaoh. Exodus 11:8 tells us Moses left Pharaoh burning with anger. He was angry because he was dealing with a fool. And interestingly enough, this is also what angered God. The book of Proverbs tells us in Proverbs 29:1, "Whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes," that's Pharaoh, he remains stiff-necked after many rebukes, "whoever remains stiff-necked after many rebukes will suddenly be destroyed without remedy." Jesus told us not to call any person a fool, and I try not to call anyone a fool. However, God is God, and he calls some people fools, and since he's God, he can do that. For example, Psalm 14:1 says, "The fool says in his heart, 'There is no God.'" This is Pharaoh's problem. In his heart, apparently he is still saying, "There is no God." Or worse, Pharaoh is saying, "I am a god," because that was what Pharaoh maintained is that he was a god. Psalm 14 describes this kind of fool. Listen carefully to the words of Psalm 14, 1 through 4. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. Now listen to this. They are corrupt. Was Pharaoh corrupt? Yes, he was. Did he do abominable deeds? Yes, he did. Well, that's what Psalm 14 says he would do. The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of men to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one. Have they no knowledge? All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread, and do not call upon the Lord. Pharaoh serves as an example for us. A negative example, but an example. Pharaoh was showing the foolishness of those who do not acknowledge God. The world foolishly opposes God. Psalm 2 speaks of the kings of the world who rage against the Lord and against his anointed and say that they're going to throw off his fetters from them. But Psalms 2, 4 through 5 tells us the one enthroned in heaven laughs. The Lord scoffs at them. He rebukes them in his anger and terrifies them in his wrath. So God is not threatened. Another translation says he holds them in derision. When he scoffs at them, it's ridiculous that man would think that they could stand against God who created them. Pharaoh is one who set himself against the Lord very foolishly. He called himself a god very foolishly and refused to acknowledge the God who put him on the throne of Egypt. That's foolishness. Besides this foolish opposition to God, Pharaoh's attitude also caused great suffering. Pharaoh ordered the killing of the Hebrew babies. Pharaoh ordered the increase of the workload beyond reason. Pharaoh refused God's demand that he let his people go. Pharaoh's self-exalting and God-ignoring attitude was the root of his evil deeds. There were two sides to what was happening in Egypt. There was the Egyptian side, where things were good. They had slaves to do their work for them. They were prosperous. And there was the Israelite side, where things were horrible. They were slaves. They were doing all the work for the Egyptians, and they were not prosperous. It is important to understand that God did not disregard or ignore the suffering of the Israelites. Although God used the sufferings of Egypt to shape and strengthen his people, he was angry with Egypt for the evil treatment of the Israelites. Malice and injustice brought God's wrath. Both God's love and God's justice were affronted by the Egyptians' treatment of God's people. God does not waste suffering. He uses suffering to grow and shape his people. James chapter 1 verse 2 tells us to consider it pure joy when we encounter various trials, because that the trying of our faith produces endurance, and that produces Christian maturity, basically. But God does not waste suffering. But even though he holds suffering, he uses suffering, he holds those responsible who, by their evil deeds, are the source of the suffering. Romans 1:8 says, "For the wrath of God is being revealed against all the ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth by their unrighteousness." Here it tells us that God's wrath is directed against unrighteousness because it suppresses the truth. Unrighteousness is the cause of all the suffering in the world. Before sin, before unrighteousness, humanity lived in a perfect garden with no suffering. God had made a perfect dwelling place, and sin ruined it. Now the problem is that we have all sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We all have unrighteousness. God's justice requires that wrongs be made right, that all debts be paid. The law says a tooth for a tooth, an eye for an eye, a blow for a blow. The Egyptians had stored up a huge debt of blows and suffering. How were they going to pay this debt? God had a plan. The Egyptians practiced primogeniture. In other words, the right of succession or inheritance belonged to the firstborn son. Thus, Pharaoh would always be a firstborn of a firstborn. The judgment falling on the firstborn of Egypt is an example of substitution or of a representative standing in for the whole. The firstborn represented all of Egyptian society, or the Egyptian social order. It was top down, with those on top using and having a power over those below. As a judgment on all the gods of Egypt and all the Egyptian social order, God struck the firstborn of every family in Egypt. This firstborn was the substitute for each family. Now, one might think that the Israelites were the oppressed and had been suffering under the Egyptians, so they would not need a substitute. But God required a substitute for the firstborn of the Israelites also. If the Israelites did not put the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel of their house, they too would have lost their firstborn. A lamb had to be killed and its blood put on the doorpost in order for a house to be passed over. This was substitution. This substitute points out that the Israelites were not without sin. Being oppressed and afflicted does not save one from sins and sin. The Israelites were sinful as well. A lamb was necessary as a substitute for the firstborn of the Israelites to be spared. All mankind is enslaved to sin. The wages of sin is death, according to Romans 6:23. We were born into this situation because the firstborn of the whole human race, Adam, sinned. And as our representative and father, he passed his sin down to all of us. Of course, we have all added our own sins to what we inherited. This same system of representation is what makes it possible for Jesus to represent all of us on the cross. Jesus is God's firstborn, and as a second Adam, he paid for our sins by representing us all on the cross. He is our substitute. Just as there was an Egyptian and Israelite side to the story in Exodus, there is a believer and unbeliever side to the story of the cross. The picture of God's judgment on Egypt and of sin on the cross is terrible. These two events show us that God will not hold back his judgment forever. When we look at the Passover and the cross, we see that God does get angry, very angry, and that he will judge sin. He will not allow unrighteousness to stand. However, these two events also show us the great love and grace of God in providing a way of escape. Even if the Egyptians had painted blood from a lamb on their doorposts, they would have been spared. God is not a respecter of persons. God does not look and say, oh, this is an Israelite, or this is this, or this is an Egyptian. When it comes to his grace, when he provides a way of escape, if we put our faith in Jesus, he saves us, no matter who we are. He gave his own Son as a Passover lamb for all mankind, and he delivers all who call upon his name. But there is a caveat. The blood must be on the doorpost. In other words, we must accept his work of atonement. We must come to Jesus. We must call on his name. We must take our own step of faith. Otherwise, the blood does not apply. First, God's deliverance is a wonderful thing. Not only did he save the Israelites from Egypt, but he also brought them out with great riches and with a great victory. He did not deliver them and then leave them as orphans with no place to go. He adopted them as his own. Consider with me the benefits God gave the Israelites when he delivered them. First, when they left with great possessions and riches. Remember that started out in 11:1-3 that God had told Moses to have the people gather the silver and gold, and they left loaded with the plunder of Egypt. And then God gave the Israelites favor with the Egyptians, and they willingly gave up their silver and gold and jewelry. God was preparing this beforehand. God does the same for us. Ephesians 4:7-8 tells us of Jesus, but grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. We've received the plunder of Jesus' victory over death. Next, God provided a substitute so that the firstborn of the Israelite families could be spared, and this continued throughout their history. every firstborn male of the Israelites was redeemed with a substitute. This is, of course, what we have been talking about when Jesus took our place on the cross. He paid our debt and satisfied the wrath of God so that now we can belong to the family of God. We can be his sons and daughters. Finally, God made a distinction between the Israelites and the Egyptians. This is the distinction between the saved and the unsaved. But Exodus 11:7 says, "But not a dog shall growl against of any of the people of Israel, either man or beast, that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel." This is actually the greatest blessing possible. I want to ask a question that Romans 8 asks. If God is for us, who can be against us? This is what Romans 8 says, 8:31 and 32. What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? It is because of this distinction that God made between his people and the Egyptians that the Israelites inherited the promised land. It is because of this distinction that they were given riches and a special place in God's plan. It is also because of this distinction that we are made co-heirs with Christ. It is because of this distinction that we are seated in the heavenlies with Christ. Does God get angry? Let's answer this question that way. Pharaoh is in hell today because he was a fool and opposed God. Don't be like Pharaoh. Call on God today.